A week before Christmas, I stood alone in my kitchen, waiting for the coffee to finish brewing, when something in the air shifted. At first, it was just noise drifting in from the living room, familiar, ordinary, the sound of my daughter Amanda talking on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen. I had no reason to. But there was something about her voice that made my steps slow as I moved closer. Something light and careless in her tone that didn't belong to a conversation about family. It sounded like she was planning a getaway, not discussing the holidays. I stopped just short of the doorway, the warmth of the mug spreading into my palms, when I heard her say, clear as day, just leave all 8 grandkids with her to watch, and that's it. She doesn't have anything else to do anyway. We're going to the hotel and finally have a peaceful time. For a moment, my mind refused to understand the words. I stood there, frozen, staring at the wall as if it might explain what my ears had just heard. 8 grandkids. All of them. Left with me. While they escaped. Amanda kept talking, laughing softly, as if this plan were clever, even generous. She mentioned the hotel at the coast, how Martin had already booked it, how they deserved a break. She said Robert and Lucy were on board too, that they were heading to a resort they'd been dreaming about. And then she said the part that made my chest tighten so painfully I had to bite my lip to stay silent. Mom has experience. She knows how to handle them. Plus, she already bought the gifts and paid for Christmas dinner. We just have to show up on the 25th, eat, open presents, and leave. She called it perfect. That word echoed inside me, heavy and bitter. Perfect for them. Perfect because they wouldn't have to worry, wouldn't have to plan, wouldn't have to carry the weight that always seemed to land on my shoulders. I slowly placed the mug on the counter, afraid the slightest sound would give me away. My hands were trembling, not with fear, but with something far older and deeper, something I had buried for years. Rage. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that screams or throws things, but the quiet, suffocating kind that grows when you realize how little you are valued. This wasn't the first time. That truth hurt almost as much as the words themselves. There had been birthdays where I cooked while they relaxed, weekends where I babysat so they could reconnect, holidays where I paid for everything because it was easier than arguing. I told myself it was love. I told myself this was what mothers did. But standing there, listening to my life being discussed like a convenience, something inside me cracked. I thought about my mornings that started early and ended late, my body aching as I chased little feet and wiped sticky hands. I thought about how no one asked if I was tired, if I had plans, if I wanted anything at all. To them, I wasn't a person with needs. I was a solution. Free childcare. Free labor. A background figure who existed to make their lives smoother. As Amanda laughed again, my mind drifted back through the years, to every moment I swallowed my feelings for the sake of peace. Every time I said yes when I wanted to say no. I realized then how carefully they had built this expectation. How slowly they had trained me to disappear behind the word mom. The coffee machine beeped softly, breaking the silence, and I flinched as if caught doing something wrong. Even though I was the one being wronged. I stepped back into the kitchen, my heart pounding, and stared down at my reflection in the dark surface of the counter. The woman looking back at me looked older than I felt. Tired in a way sleep never fixes. But behind the exhaustion, there was something new, something dangerous. Awareness. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about how to make Christmas work for everyone else. I was thinking about myself. And that terrified me almost as much as it empowered me. Because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. And once something wakes up inside you, it doesn't quietly go back to sleep. That night, after the house finally went quiet, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of my home settling, the ticking clock, the distant hum of the refrigerator, noises that had always comforted me, but now felt like reminders of how long I had been invisible inside my own life. Amanda's words replayed over and over in my head, not just what she said, but how she said it, with ease, with certainty, as if my time, my energy, my very existence were resources she had every right to claim. I realized then that this plan hadn't been thrown together casually. It had been assumed, rehearsed, agreed upon without a single thought given to asking me. And that realization hurt more than anger ever could. I thought about how often I had filled this role without complaint, How I had told friends I didn't mind watching the kids. How I smiled when people praised me for being so devoted. Never realizing that devotion had quietly become expectation. Somewhere along the way, love had turned into obligation, and obligation into entitlement. The next morning, I moved through my routine like a ghost, making breakfast, folding laundry, nodding along as Amanda talked about Christmas decorations and menus, all while carrying the weight of what I now knew. She didn't mention the phone call. She didn't have to. Her confidence said everything. When she casually reminded me how energetic the kids were this year, and joked that I'd need strong coffee, I felt something shift again inside me, sharper this time. I watched her carefully, noticing things I had ignored before. The way she avoided my eyes when she talked about plans. The way she spoke as if decisions had already been finalized. And for the first time, I wondered when my silence had taught her that this behavior was acceptable. Later that afternoon, I sat alone at the dining table, staring at the list of gifts I had already bought, the grocery plans I had made, the mental checklist that always lived in my head. I imagined 8 children running through the house while their parents slept in hotel rooms with ocean views, sipping wine and calling it self-care. I imagined Christmas morning without help, without thanks, without even the courtesy of being asked. And then I imagined something else, something I had never allowed myself to picture before. A Christmas that didn't revolve around everyone else's comfort. The thought felt rebellious, almost wrong, like stepping out of line after a lifetime of obedience. Guilt crept in immediately, whispering that this was what mothers did, that refusing would make me selfish, ungrateful, cold. I had lived with that guilt for so long that it felt like part of my identity. But underneath it now was something stronger. A quiet voice asking why my needs had never mattered enough to be considered. I remembered my own mother, how she gave endlessly and quietly resented it. How she aged faster than she should have, worn down by a life of constant giving. I had promised myself I would be different. Yet here I was, repeating the same pattern, mistaking sacrifice for love. That evening, as I wrapped presents alone, the house glowing softly with Christmas lights, I made a decision that scared me more than anything else ever had. I decided I would not confront anyone in anger. I would not shout, accuse, or beg to be understood. Instead, I would do something far more difficult. I would change the script. I didn't yet know exactly how or when, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. This Christmas would not unfold the way they expected. I folded the wrapping paper carefully, my hands steady for the first time in days, and felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't relief. It was resolve. And as the tree lights blinked softly in the corner, I understood that the most dangerous moment in any relationship is not when someone gets angry, but when they finally stop accepting what hurts them. Over the next few days, I became unusually quiet. Not because I was unsure, but because I was watching, listening, and learning in a way I never had before. Every conversation felt different now, every casual comment sharper, more revealing. Amanda talked freely about her plans, about how exhausted she was from parenting, about how much she and Martin needed, just a few days to breathe. And each time she spoke, it became clearer that my role in their lives had already been written without my consent. Robert dropped by one afternoon, and joked about how lucky the kids were to have such a hands-on grandma. Laughing as if it were a compliment, not realizing how heavy those words felt to someone who had never been allowed to say no. Even Lucy chimed in during a group call, mentioning how relieved she was that Mom has everything under control, as if I were a service provider rather than a person. I nodded along, smiled when expected, and kept my voice steady, but inside I was taking notes, not on paper but in my heart. I noticed how none of them asked how I was feeling, whether I was tired, or if I had plans of my own. It struck me that they didn't avoid asking because they were afraid of the answer. They avoided asking because they assumed there was no alternative. That assumption was my fault as much as theirs. I had trained them well, teaching them through years of compliance that my time was flexible, my needs optional, my boundaries non-existent. One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and allowed myself to imagine what would happen if I broke that pattern. The scenarios played out in my head one by one: anger, disappointment, guilt-tripping phone calls, accusations of being dramatic or ungrateful. I knew those reactions well. I had seen them used on others. And yet, imagining them no longer filled me with dread. Instead, it filled me with a strange sense of freedom. For the first time, I realized that their reactions were not my responsibility. I didn't need to manage their emotions the way I had always managed everything else. That realization felt like setting down a weight I hadn't known I was carrying. The next morning, I made a list not of chores or gifts, but of things I wanted: rest, quiet, dignity, and respect. It was a short list, but it felt revolutionary. I began making small changes, subtle ones at first. I stopped volunteering extra help. I delayed answering messages. I let phone calls go to voicemail and returned them when I felt ready. No one said anything directly, but I sensed the confusion growing. They were used to immediate access to me, to my availability being guaranteed. That silence unsettled them, even if they didn't yet understand why. I also started preparing in ways they didn't notice. I canceled a few pre-orders quietly, adjusted plans without announcing them, and put aside the receipts I had kept out of habit. Each small act felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. There were moments when guilt surged back, usually late at night, whispering that I was being unfair, that this was how families worked, that love required sacrifice. But then I remembered Amanda's laugh on the phone, the word perfect, and the guilt faded. Love, I realized, should never feel like erasure. By the time Christmas week approached, the air in the house felt tense, though no one could quite explain why. Amanda became more directive, more confident in her assumptions, while I became calmer, almost detached. I knew something they didn't, and that knowledge gave me strength. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was simply choosing myself for the first time in decades. And as the calendar pages flipped closer to Christmas, I understood that the real surprise this year wouldn't be wrapped in paper or tied with a ribbon. It would be the moment they realized that the woman they had taken for granted had finally remembered her own worth. By the time Christmas week officially arrived, the house no longer felt like my home. It felt like a station where everyone passed through with expectations already packed and labeled in my name. Amanda showed up more frequently, her tone brisk, her words efficient, as if she were managing a project instead of visiting her mother. She talked about schedules, drop-off times, dietary preferences for the kids, and how organized everything needed to be so their little getaway could be stress-free. I listened quietly, nodding when required, but inside I felt a calm so unfamiliar it almost frightened me. It wasn't resignation, it was clarity. The night before everything was supposed to begin, Amanda called me into the living room with that voice she used when she assumed agreement. She sat on the couch scrolling through her phone and said, "Okay, so tomorrow Robert will drop his kids first, then Lucy around noon, and ours by evening. We'll all pick them up on the 25th after lunch." She said it so casually, like she was confirming a dinner reservation. I waited a few seconds before responding, feeling the weight of years pressing against my chest, and then I said softly but firmly, "That won't work." The room went silent. Amanda looked up slowly, her brows knitting together in confusion rather than concern. "What do you mean?" she asked, laughing lightly, as if I were joking. I repeated myself, this time clearer. "I won't be watching all 8 children. I already have other plans." The words felt foreign in my mouth, but once spoken, they took root. Her expression shifted instantly, disbelief giving way to irritation. "Mom, don't start this now," she said, standing up. "Everything's already planned. The hotel's booked. You've always done this." That sentence hit harder than anything else she said. "You've always done this." As if that erased my right to choose differently now. I took a breath, grounding myself. "Exactly," I replied. "I've always done this. And that's why you never thought to ask." Her voice rose, sharp with frustration. She accused me of being selfish, of ruining Christmas, of not caring about her or the kids. Each word was meant to pull me back into my old role, the dependable, guilt-driven mother who fixed everything. But something inside me refused to move. I told her I loved my grandchildren, that this wasn't about punishment or anger, but that I was no longer willing to be used as a solution for everyone else's convenience. She scoffed, pacing the room, muttering about how unbelievable this was, how she couldn't believe I'd do this to her. At one point she even said, "You're retired, Mom. What else do you have to do?" That question, spoken without malice but full of assumption, broke something open in me. I looked at her and said, "I have a life. I just never made you see it." She stared at me as if I were a stranger. When she stormed out later that night, slamming the door behind her, the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was peaceful. For the first time in years, I slept through the night without replaying conversations in my head. The next morning, the calls started. Robert tried reason, Lucy tried guilt, and Amanda tried anger again. I listened to each of them without interrupting, without defending myself excessively, and repeated the same sentence every time. "I won't be available." Some of them hung up abruptly. Others accused me of changing, as if that were an insult. But with every call, I felt stronger. I realized how much power I had given away simply by being afraid of disappointing them. Christmas Eve arrived quietly. No kids running through the halls, no chaotic cooking schedule, no last-minute errands. I made myself breakfast slowly, savoring the silence. That evening, I wrapped the few gifts I had chosen to keep, not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection. I didn't know how the family would handle the sudden gap I had left behind, but for the first time, that wasn't my burden to carry. I had finally stepped out of the role they assigned me and into the person I had neglected for far too long. And as I sat by the window watching the lights come on across the neighborhood, I understood something deeply. Setting boundaries doesn't break families. It only exposes the ones that were built on convenience instead of respect. Christmas morning arrived without the chaos I had carried on my shoulders for decades, and that absence felt almost unreal, like waking up in someone else's life. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, and for a moment guilt crept in, not because I had done something wrong, but because I had been conditioned to feel responsible for everyone else's comfort. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed repeatedly, messages stacking one after another. Photos of hotel breakfasts, ocean views, and smiling faces began to appear in the family group chat, followed by comments that felt intentionally cheerful, as if to remind me what I was missing. But beneath the forced positivity, I sensed tension. One message from Lucy read, "The kids are a bit wild today," followed by a laughing emoji that didn't quite hide the strain. Another from Robert mentioned how hard it was to manage meals with so many little ones in a hotel room. I didn't respond. For the first time, I allowed their inconvenience to exist without rushing in to fix it. That afternoon, Amanda finally called. Her voice was tight, exhaustion pressing through every word. She complained about the noise, the mess, how the kids wouldn't settle down, how this was supposed to be relaxing but wasn't turning out that way. She paused, clearly waiting for me to offer help, advice, reassurance. When I didn't, she sighed sharply and said, "You could have warned us it would be this hard." That sentence stunned me. Warn them? I had lived this reality for years. I calmly replied, "You've always known. You just never had to deal with it yourself." Silence followed. Not the angry kind, but the uncomfortable kind that comes when a truth lands too close to home. She changed the subject quickly, asked how I was doing, her tone suddenly cautious, as if she were approaching unfamiliar ground. I told her the truth, that I was peaceful, that I had taken a walk that morning, visited a neighbor in the afternoon, and planned to spend the evening quietly. She didn't know how to respond to that. Later that night, after dinner alone, I reflected on how often I had equated love with sacrifice, believing that being needed was the same as being valued. It wasn't until I stepped back that I saw how unbalanced that belief had been. The next day, Christmas Day itself, arrived with a mix of emotions. I missed my grandchildren deeply, missed their laughter, their sticky fingers, their excitement over presents. But missing them didn't mean I regretted my decision. When the family finally arrived in the afternoon, exhausted and subdued, the energy was different. They weren't triumphant, they weren't relaxed, and they weren't as confident as they had been when they left. The kids ran to me first, wrapping their arms around my legs, telling stories all at once. I hugged them warmly, genuinely happy to see them, but I noticed how Amanda hovered nearby, watching me carefully. Over dinner, no one mentioned the hotel or the stress directly, but it lingered in the air unspoken. At one point, Robert joked half-heartedly about how Grandma's job isn't as easy as it looks, and Lucy laughed a little too loudly. Amanda stayed quiet. Later, as we cleared the table together, she finally spoke in a low voice. "I didn't realize how much you did," she admitted, not meeting my eyes. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall she had built. I didn't rush to comfort her or dismiss it. I simply said, "I didn't realize either," until I stopped. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone again, but this time the loneliness didn't feel heavy. It felt chosen. I understood now that boundaries don't just protect you. They teach others how to see you clearly. And while things weren't magically fixed, something had shifted. They would never look at me the same way again. And for the first time, I realized that was exactly what needed to happen. In the days that followed Christmas, something subtle but undeniable began to change. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet spaces where habits usually live untouched. The family group chat, once filled with casual demands disguised as jokes, grew noticeably quieter. When messages did appear, they were phrased differently, less assumptive, more cautious, as if everyone were suddenly aware that my time was no longer an unlimited resource they could draw from without asking. Amanda called a few days later, not with a crisis or a favor, but with a question. She asked how I was feeling, not in the superficial way people sometimes ask, but genuinely, awkwardly, like someone learning a new language. We spoke longer than usual, and for the first time in years she listened more than she talked. She admitted how overwhelming the hotel trip had been, how coordinating 8 children with different needs, schedules, and moods had drained her more than she expected. She laughed weakly and said, "I don't know how you did it for so long." I didn't respond with pride or resentment. I simply said, "I didn't always do it well. I just didn't think I had a choice." That statement seemed to sit with her. Over the next week, small things kept happening that confirmed the shift. Lucy asked before dropping by instead of assuming I would be home. Robert offered to host Sunday dinner rather than letting it default to me. These gestures were imperfect and sometimes clumsy, but they mattered because they were new. Still, I wasn't naive enough to believe everything had suddenly been fixed. Decades of patterns don't dissolve overnight. There were moments when old instincts resurfaced. When Amanda would sigh about being tired in that familiar way that once would have pulled me back into overfunctioning. Each time I paused, I asked myself whether stepping in was an act of love or an act of fear. More often than not, it had always been fear. The fear of being unnecessary, of being forgotten, of losing my place. Letting go of that fear felt like learning to walk again, after years of leaning on a wall. One afternoon, as I sat in the living room with a book I had been meaning to read for years, I realized how rarely I had allowed myself uninterrupted time. The silence no longer felt empty, it felt spacious. I began to fill my days differently. I joined a local walking group, reconnected with an old friend I had lost touch with because I was always too busy, and even signed up for a painting class at the community center, something I had always dismissed as impractical. Each choice felt small, but together they formed a quiet declaration. My life did not end where my usefulness to others stopped. The most unexpected change, however, came from the grandchildren. Without me constantly present, their parents had to step up more fully, and in doing so, they began to see their children not as interruptions to adult life, but as responsibilities that couldn't be outsourced. When I did spend time with the kids, it was different. Lighter. More intentional. I wasn't exhausted or resentful. I was present. They noticed it too. "You're happier, Grandma," one of them said casually, without realizing how deeply it landed. Of course, there were moments of discomfort. At a family gathering in early January, tension flickered when Amanda joked about how independent I had become. The word carried a hint of defensiveness. I didn't take the bait. I smiled and said, "I finally learned something new." That night, driving home alone, I reflected on how often women of my generation were taught that self-erasure was a virtue. We were praised for endurance, for silence, for putting everyone else first, and then quietly blamed when we burned out. I had lived that lesson faithfully for years, believing it was love. Now I understood that love without boundaries slowly turns into obligation. And obligation breeds resentment on both sides. This new phase of my life wasn't about revenge or punishment. It wasn't about making anyone feel guilty. It was about honesty, about refusing to continue a role that diminished me. And while the path ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear. I would never again confuse being needed with being respected. That realization, more than anything else, felt like freedom. By mid-January, the unspoken tension that had been quietly settling between us finally surfaced, not in an argument or a dramatic outburst, but during an ordinary Sunday lunch that Amanda insisted on hosting at her place. I almost declined out of habit, the old instinct to avoid discomfort whispering in my ear, but this time I said yes, knowing that growth rarely happens in comfortable silence. The house was warm, the table carefully set, and the children were unusually calm, as if everyone sensed that something fragile was unfolding. Conversation flowed easily at first. Weather, school schedules, small plans for the year ahead. But underneath it all, I felt the familiar pull of old roles trying to reassert themselves. At one point, Amanda casually mentioned how much easier the holidays would be next year now that everything is sorted. And for a brief moment, I saw the old assumption flicker in her eyes. Instead of letting it slide, I took a breath and spoke, my voice steady but firm. I told her that I loved being part of the family, that I cherished my grandchildren deeply, but that I would no longer be available by default, no longer the automatic solution to everyone else's convenience. I explained that helping would now be a choice, not an expectation, and that I needed my time and energy to be respected the same way anyone else's was. The table went quiet. No one interrupted me, which in itself felt like a small miracle. Amanda's face shifted through a series of emotions, surprise, defensiveness, and finally something softer, something that looked like recognition. She admitted, slowly and without excuses, that she had never really considered how heavy the burden had been on me because I had never allowed it to show. "You always seemed fine," she said, almost apologetically. I told her that appearing fine was something I had practiced for years, and that it had come at a cost I was no longer willing to pay. Robert and Lucy listened too, their expressions thoughtful, perhaps realizing that they had benefited from my silence, just as much as Amanda had. No one argued. No one tried to minimize my feelings. That, more than any apology, told me that something had truly shifted. Later that afternoon, as I watched the grandchildren play in the yard, I felt an unfamiliar lightness settle in my chest. The weight I had carried for decades, the responsibility to hold everything together at my own expense, was no longer mine alone. Driving home that evening, I reflected on how different this confrontation felt from the ones I had imagined in my head over the years. There was no shouting, no guilt-tripping, no dramatic declarations. Just honesty, delivered calmly, without asking for permission or forgiveness. In the days that followed, boundaries were tested in small ways, as they always are. A last-minute request here, an implied expectation there. Each time, I responded thoughtfully instead of automatically, sometimes saying yes, sometimes saying no, and always reminding myself that my worth did not depend on how much I gave. Slowly the family adjusted. They had to. Life went on. Dinners still happened, birthdays were celebrated, and holidays were planned with more shared responsibility. What changed was the undercurrent. I was no longer invisible labor. I was a participant, a respected one. Perhaps the most profound change, however, was internal. I stopped narrating my life through the lens of sacrifice. I allowed myself to rest without guilt, to pursue interests without justification, to say no without rehearsing explanations. I realized that reclaiming my time wasn't selfish. It was necessary. One evening, as I sat alone watching the sunset from my living room window, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude, not because everything was perfect, but because I had finally chosen myself without abandoning anyone else. The story of my life was no longer about being endlessly available. It was about being fully present, first for myself, and then intentionally for others. And for the first time in a very long while, that felt like enough. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, I began to notice changes not just in my family, but in myself, changes so subtle yet so powerful that they reshaped how I moved through the world. Mornings no longer started with a sense of obligation, with a mental checklist of who might need me, or what problem I was expected to solve. Instead, they began with quiet choices. Whether I wanted coffee or tea, whether I felt like reading or walking, whether the day belonged to others or finally to me. The phone still rang, messages still came, but the tone had changed. Requests were phrased with care now, with pauses that hadn't existed before, and sometimes even with genuine consideration. If you're free, they would say. Only if it's okay with you. Those words mattered more than they probably realized. I didn't always say no, but when I did, I no longer felt the sting of guilt trailing behind my answer. I had learned that love doesn't require exhaustion to prove its sincerity. During Easter, we gathered again, this time at Robert's house, and I watched as everyone pitched in without being asked. Children helping set the table, adults coordinating meals together. No one assumed I would carry the day on my shoulders. When Amanda hugged me goodbye that evening, she whispered, "Thank you for teaching us." And though her words were simple, they carried the weight of acknowledgement I had waited decades to hear. Later that night, sitting alone with the quiet hum of the house around me, I reflected on how easily years can slip by when you believe your role is to serve quietly in the background. I realized how many women, how many parents, especially mothers and grandmothers, disappear into expectations without ever being asked if they are willing. I thought about how silence can be mistaken for strength, and how endurance can be mistaken for consent. What changed my life wasn't confrontation alone. It was the moment I decided that my presence mattered even when I wasn't useful. That I didn't have to earn my place at the table through sacrifice. I began doing things I had postponed for years, joining a book club, taking a short trip on my own, saying yes to invitations that had nothing to do with family duty. And with each small act of self-respect, I felt something inside me heal. The grandchildren still loved me just as fiercely, perhaps even more so, because they saw a version of me that smiled freely, laughed easily, and wasn't quietly worn down by resentment. I understood then that boundaries don't create distance, they create clarity. They teach others how to love you properly. If there is one thing I want anyone hearing my story to understand, it is this. It is never too late to choose yourself. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in truth. You can love deeply without disappearing. You can give generously without being emptied. And you can step into the next chapter of your life not as someone's backup plan, but as your own priority. That Christmas, which once felt like the breaking point of my spirit, became the beginning of my freedom. I didn't walk away from my family. I walked back to myself. And in doing so, I finally found peace. Not because everyone changed overnight, but because I did.